Welcome. My name is Will Torres. I'm one of the admission officers here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. I'm so excited that you're here with us today, talking about kind of preparing for a journey into the world of technology and product management. We're here to really talk about how to use that MBA and the GSB experience specifically if you're thinking about launching into a career in the technology or product management space. And so to get us oriented to our conversation today, we're going to do a brief overview, especially about what some of the career outcomes look like post-MBA. We are going to get to know our panelists, and then from there, I'll have a few questions, and we're really going to open it up from there. The Q&A box is, again, going to be where you're going to be able to ask your questions. If there is a question that you like, I encourage you to use that thumbs up button. That's going to upvote that question and bring it to the top of the list. You'll also see a quick survey going on right now about when you're thinking about applying. This is also helpful for us as we start to think about what tips, best practices, and words of wisdom we might be able to share with you today. So, as part of that overview, so when you come to Stanford GSB, the world really does become your oyster. There is the Career Management Center who works with all of our students. About a third of students get opportunities through there, another third from alumni, as well as our fellow classmates. So there is no shortage of places for folks to find both full-time as well as internship opportunities during your time and beyond. About 91% of the class of 2020 had job offers within 3 months of graduation. And people had this sense of confidence of being able to find something that they were really interested and that was meaningful for them. I know I've had a number of conversations about folks who said, you know what, I have this job offer and I know there's something better out there for me. Part of the Stanford experience was helping them build that confidence to know that yes, something was out there, and yes, they will find it. And kind of long story short, they did. About 71% of folks who come to Stanford made some kind of pivot, whether it's geography, industry, function. And this is a question I often get. If you write something in your application now, we don't hold you to that. So if you're interested in tech, but you end up in consulting, that's wonderful. Coming to business school is about expanding your horizons and seeing what else is out there. If something speaks to you, if you want to explore that world and take that step, we are here to help you make that happen. And now to give a little bit more light to this process specifically, let's go ahead and meet our panelists. So Tomer, could you please tell us a little bit about what you're doing now? And did you know you wanted to go into like the tech product space coming into the GSB?
Yeah, it's a great introduction. Thanks, Will. So hi, everyone. My name is Tomer Schwartz. I'm part of the class of 2018 from here at the GSB. I am currently working as a product manager, a product lead at a tech, call it startup, a Series B startup in San Francisco called Rippling. To your question around whether or not I knew I wanted to be in technology or not, it's a good question. I think coming into the GSB, I had worked in technology before. I had actually only worked in product management for about 6 months prior to the GSB. So, you know, I would say it was more of an educated hypothesis than like a firm belief. But definitely I had a bit of a taste of it before. Prior to product management, I had done stuff around implementation of customers. And so I had seen different parts of what it'd be like to work at tech, like mostly enterprise B2B tech companies. And so heading into the GSB, I knew it was something that I wanted to poke a little bit further on and see if that was going to be the right thing post-graduation. And at least so far, it has seemed that way 3 years after graduation.
Yeah. Did you do much exploring during your time at the GSB?
Yeah, I did a bit of exploring. My undergraduate major was in biochemistry. And so I had always had a bit of an itch to see whether or not life sciences would be a place where I could angle my way. And so that was definitely a hypothesis coming in. And while I worked for my first 2 years out of undergrad at a a tech firm focused on pharmaceutical companies. I spent a bit of time during my first year at the GSB. I actually did like a part-time internship during the winter at a company working with actually mRNA, which since COVID has become very hot. It was less hot at the time. And, you know, it was a good hands-on experience seeing. I did some like strategy and biz ops for them. And ultimately, I ended up deciding to kind of stick with tech, though for my summer internships, my first year, I did pursue sort of both in a parallel track, but ended up going more angling towards tech. I would say relatively quickly. I think by March of my first year, I'd become pretty confident that that was going to be the likely route, at least immediately post graduation.
Yeah, for that winter term internship, was that part of a program, or was that something that you kind of pursued independently? Like, how did you go about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say it's like it ended up being a little bit of both. I'm trying to remember where I found out about it. I believe it had been posted by either one of my classmates through a friend of a friend, or it was on like the career. So the career website sort of like routinely updates stuff, and it's the stuff that they update is not only for full-time or official internship stuff. Some of it is a little bit more ad hoc. So it was a resource that I used pretty extensively throughout my time to kind of see like, hey, every few days, like, is there something interesting? It's a fairly like low cost effort to hop on the website and see if there's interesting stuff. Of course, I'd say pursuing a part-time internship during school is a major like decision, just because of all the different things vying for your time when you're at the GSB, which are awesome. And you normally have to trade stuff off. You can't do everything despite our desire to. So I think now that I think of it, I probably found out about it from that career website.
And you already like started to go into what I was about to ask you. How did you balance both that internship plus like winter quarter of your MBA
Yeah.
1 year? Didn't you still have like some of your core requirements? Like,
Oh yeah. So I think winter quarter freshman year for MBA 1 year is known as like one of the more brutal academic quarters, because you're usually finance is the kind of killer class in that set. Um, it was not a, I think the internship I ended up devoting about 10 to 12 hours a week. So it wasn't crazy, but again, it was up in San Francisco. So I was taking, you know, Wednesdays, we normally like don't have classes at the GSB. So it was a good opportunity to head up to the city and do like, you know, mostly a full day in the office there. And then I would usually do kind of like half a day either on Fridays or on Mondays with whatever worked out. It was not easy, and there was a lot of like, I would say, jealousy seeing what other classmates of mine were doing at the time. But I felt like it was still worth investigating, especially prior to my internship, my like kind of full-time internship first year. So because I wanted to say like, okay, this seems like the right route. It doesn't seem like the right route. In this case, it didn't seem like the right route. So I think it was time well spent.
yeah. And then kind of sticking on this theme of internships. So you did 2 internships in the summer between your MBA 1 and MBA 2 year?
No. I did.
Oh.
So I did that one in the winter. I didn't do what we call like a GST. I just did one. I did a 12-week internship at PayPal between my first and second years.
Okay. And then there's a question here about how early does recruiting start for project management internships at some of the firms? Like, do you have any insight there?
Yeah. So it really depends how big of a company you're looking to intern at. So the general trend that you'll see is that the large companies that have, you know, very organized headcount modeling and recruiting processes are able to kick off that process actually like towards like the end of November. You start chit-chatting with them and seeing what's out there, and then interviews will actually begin around the middle of January when you return from winter break, heading into February. That said, I say the majority of people that are looking to go into tech end up getting their internships in the spring quarter, which is between April and June. And that is usually at smaller companies, but even some of the larger companies kind of come through with opportunities later on in the year. So it depends I think one thing that's helpful in coming in is sort of having a hypothesis of whether or not a large company is of interest, a small company is of interest, both, because that'll sort of define the timeline that you end up taking.
Yeah. And so like were recruiters coming to campus? Did you do some initial reach out, or how did you make some of these connections or to learn about the opportunities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I started with, again, like the lowest friction approach, which is the career website. So that was, again, the easiest place to access. I think it was after the 6 week, I can't even remember what it's called, but there's a bit of a moratorium on career stuff during the first 6 weeks, which is actually great, to let people settle into academics on campus for your MBA 1 year. And then like everything sort of like opens up. And so I recall, checking out the career website a bit, and then, starting to develop my own list. There are a bunch of other resources if you're more focused on, smaller companies, if you're focused on specific niches within the tech sector. Tech can stand for a lot of different things. And then obviously you start kind of poking at like alumni and the alumni directory, seeing what kind of random emails come through from classmates who used to work at these companies. You start doing a lot of coffee chats with MBA 2s who are usually really like nice and generous with their time. So it's a whole host of things. And that's kind of what I was getting at with like time is at a premium for everything at the GSB. And so being a little bit thrifty with how you spend it is really critical.
Yeah. And then as you're thinking about your journey, and then other friends or folks that who have gone into the tech space or the product management space, there's a question here about like, do you have to have a background in product management to get an internship or a job after, or kind of how does that look like?
That's a great question. I think it's a pretty common question that a lot of my classmates came in with as well. And definitely a concern, because a lot of people come in with a sort of an itch or a hypothesis saying, this product thing sounds interesting. I've done a bit of research, but can I get in? I definitely have a lot of classmates who did not have product experience who were able to get into product. The way that I usually look at it, with product is sort of like what strengths you can play on, and prior experience and background is a facet, but definitely not the only facet. So other sort of pillars to think about when you're considering this sort of career would be, one, like, I think attention to detail is critical. I think the ability to think strategically, especially as future MBA graduates, is a huge one to play up. And that's something that companies will really be looking for. Being analytical. So a lot of folks that have like, consulting experience or finance experience can sort of leverage that and play that up in their interview. Another critical facet that people are looking for when it relates to product is interpersonal skills. Like product managers end up being in the middle of a whole bunch of different functions at their company. And for better or worse, your key to success is being able to communicate with your other team members who are not product managers and sort of speaking their languages. So some of the, what we call like soft skills that are very, that we focus on a lot at the GSB, end up really helping with that. So I would say as far as recruiting goes, you have to strategically like understand what company you're interviewing at, who you're talking to, and what strengths you can play up. It won't be the same sort of script or story that you can tell at every company. It really will depend on like how you can convince that like you have the right skill set to bring to them, and given the specific team that you're interviewing at, the specific industry that the company is at. But you definitely will have, both like from your pre-GSB experience and GSB experience, a bunch of tools in your toolkit to talk about during the interview process, even if you don't have more classic, like I was a PM prior to the GSB.
Yeah. Perfect segue. Let's talk about some of these tools. I know on one side there are some of like the hard skills, and then you mentioned some of the softer skills, interpersonal kind of elements that are so critical to your work.
Yeah,
Can you tell me a little bit about like any classes? Let's
sure.
start with like the soft skill side, like the
Yeah,
interpersonal, like any that stood out to you, and why.
of course. I mean, I think for the very like we joke about this as GSB graduates, but like the class that you will often hear about is colloquially called touchy-feely or interpersonal dynamics. And I think for me it was a class that I heard about coming prior to coming to the GSB, and it definitely did not disappoint. It's this really interesting experiential class where you spend the majority of your time, rather than like in a lecture setting, you end up spending it with what's called like a T group, which is a group of 12 of you plus 11 of your classmates plus a facilitator. And you go through a bunch of, call it an interpersonal journey for a quarter. And that one's really critical, I think, for understanding how other people perceive you, how different things that you end up saying really touch other people, even if you don't necessarily mean them. And then kind of, if you want to think about it more about like, how do I get my job done? It's also how you can influence people. Ultimately, like a lot of this stuff is about, especially when it comes to product, it's around influence. Like, how can you influence people to believe in the problems that you're trying to prioritize as a product manager? And so that class, touchy-feely or interpersonal dynamics, is definitely a critical one. I think, there are a few other classes that I think are mentioned less often around soft skills. So for example, one is called like acting with power, which is a really fun one where you literally like act. It is a very real like acting, which for me was not a point of comfort. Acting, not something I had background in, but it was a really fun, unique like experience that you can only achieve in school. I think it's very difficult to replicate elsewhere in the workplace. And we actually like would have scripts slash like academic materials explaining how different tactics cause people to perceive us in different ways. And it sounds very like egomaniacal, but it can go a long way when you're in different sort of situations in the workplace. So those are some of the softer ones. Will, do you want me to transition to some more tangible things?
Oh no, I actually have a couple more questions here.
Okay.
I think this is like a fascinating track of conversation. Like talking about like how you show up in a space and how you exert influence. There are a couple questions here about, and I'm sure this is going to be a recurring question that comes up over our conversation, but from either touchy-feely, acting with power, or any of the other classes, maybe even leadership labs, where like, have there been any instances where you've been implementing some of the things you've learned in there, and like how has that like affected the way that you operate in the working place?
Oh, all the time. I mean, especially like, I always joke, for better or worse, like in product, like I have not had a moment where I could be like alone in a room just doing stuff, which means that everything is interpersonal, right? Everything is about how people are reacting to the ideas that I'm bringing forth, how I'm reacting to their input and collaboration. And so for me, a few of the examples that I think about are, we learn about when to use emotion, for example, and how to express like different levels of emotion, and how someone can be like even keeled for the majority of their time, as when them, all of a sudden when they engage in extreme emotion, you really pay attention to that because it's so different than their like standard status quo. And so that's a tactic that I've used a few times at work to really get a point across. It's not something that I would choose to abuse, but is one that I remember when I went through it, it was kind of like an aha finding moment from Touchy Feely, that people gave me feedback that said like, I was really surprised when you act that way. It really made me pay attention. And it was something that was not something that I did on purpose in touchy-feely, because it happened to be like a very involuntary reaction to something that happened there, but was a really powerful learning. And then, the other one is around how to that I would talk about is around how to show, kind of like use vulnerability to get people to understand you better and to trust you. So I think that was one of, again, a huge lesson from these classes around I think that the kind of, I call it cheap learning, is to never show cracks in the armor, right? To never waver from like a strong, determined person who knows what they're doing. But actually there are many times where showing just like a little bit of vulnerability, or a lot of vulnerability, if it's with the right audience or the right people who that's what it takes to get them on board, can be incredibly powerful. The tricky thing is that it doesn't work on everyone, and it doesn't work at the right time, which is one of the frustrating learnings from the class. Like, it's not a perfect playbook. There's a lot of kind of try and learn, but these have definitely been important things for me as I've gone back into the world the last 3 years to get my points across and be a successful product manager.
Yeah, I love how that comes back to what you're talking about earlier about getting the tools you need to succeed. And it's here's the tool, and then in that try and iterate and kind of workshopping it over the course of your career, you're just continuing to sharpen and kind of fine tune those tools to the settings that you need it for.
Exactly. There's a lot of fine tuning. Sometimes you miss a little bit, but there's a lot of fine tuning.
Yeah, that's part of the process too, right? How do we embrace quote unquote failure or as opportunities to learn, growth mindset, that spirit of feedback. Feedback is a gift.
Absolutely. Yeah, that feedback is the gift is something that you hear a lot at the GSB, and I think is something that can be not fun to take, both at the GSB and in the real world, but it is a really powerful was a really powerful takeaway. And I think something that I still sort of will, as you said, workshop and tinker with and decide how to really take in. And it is helpful to not be defensive about feedback that comes in. And that was a big, for me personally, at least, a big learning during my time here.
Yeah. I mean, it's a learning that I'm still trying to process even in the working world. It's just oh, I feel something. Let's unpack that.
Exactly.
Let's switch over to the hard skills. I know we talked a lot about the personal development, how you show up in a space, how you influence. Kind of what are also some of the technical hard skills that you find are helpful in your job, kind of whether it's in product itself or just kind of in the tech world writ large? Because I know there are also some questions here about what are other opportunities in the world of tech beyond product management?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so a few classes that come to mind, for me, the areas so I was a biochem major. So for me, academically, a lot of this stuff was new. So there were a few marketing classes, for example, that I found to be helpful. So one that comes to mind is a class called consumer behavior. We really focused on, I wouldn't call them tricks, but actual tactics and strategies to get consumers to better go towards your desired outcome. Let's put it that way. And so I think, that one in particular is important if you're thinking about going to a B2C company, where your main user will be a consumer, but it's still helpful even for me at a company like Rippling, where I work today, that is B2B, where most of my customers are business customers, but it's small businesses. So they tend to act like consumers. And so when I think about things like visual design and how we talk to them, I definitely think of some of the lessons from that class. Honestly, my intro to marketing class around things like segmentation and positioning and targeting was really critical. I didn't have any background in that. I definitely came from the mindset that marketing was some voodoo art that didn't have a lot of, actual like discipline to it. And so that has been really helpful in thinking about how you, like for me, at least as a product manager, like how I focus on my customers, how I segment them, who like my target customer is, how I can make sure that when I'm building something or I'm prioritizing something, I'm really, really focused on what I've refined as the target segment and not just trying to like peanut butter to an entire like market, because that's impossible to solve. And so that has been very important. And then, you know, there's a lot of like, I had never taken an accounting class, to be honest. And I actually, you know, some people say, oh, accounting, it's boring, it's this and that. I think it's really critical, like a really critical foundation for anyone who's going to end up being a leader in business, even if you're not going to be an accountant. And I don't think anyone in my class really went deep into like specializing in accounting, but it's a really critical core skill to understand, you know, profit and loss statement in cash flows and things of that nature. It makes you much more like able to talk when you're in a room with other folks, maybe finance folks that are trying to make decisions around how to allocate headcount to your team. And you're like, I want to go toe to toe with you and make sure that I get the proper headcount that I need. Like you're able to do that a lot more than someone who's just like, I'm only a product manager and just like put the heads on my team of people. Like, so actually having like a detailed numbers-based conversation is incredibly helpful. And then lastly, I mean, some other classes that were very specific, not very specific, but ended up really helping in product are, so one is Startup Garage. You know, Startup Garage sort of employs like design thinking to how you refine like a problem and then eventually think through a hypothesis and point of view statement and a solution, which, you know, even though Startup Garage sort of sounds like something that you would do if you want to go only into entrepreneurship, that's actually like not quite correct. Like the frameworks that are taught there, I use pretty routinely in product, because we really try in product to think about, you know, agile development and hypothesis-based development. And so this type of a class really forces you to go through the rigor of refining a problem, asking a bajillion questions, doing really good customer discovery before you ever think about a solution. And so like that one, I actually don't think was properly advertised. I remember when going through it as like, oh, this will help you if you want to go into product. It was sort of like, hey, people that are thinking about entrepreneurship, like go here. And looking back on it, that one was really helpful. The last one that I talk about is called Aligning Startups with Their Market, which I actually don't know if it's still being offered, but was really helpful. And again, even though aligning startups with their market sounds like it's really focused on entrepreneurship, it can be leveraged for basically any new product initiative, even if it's at a larger company, in my opinion. And so again, really focused on customer discovery and how you pivot, how you judge when you may have reached product market fit, how you think about scaling it. So those are a few of the classes that come to mind. There are obviously a bunch of other ones that I found to be helpful throughout the last.
I love all of the like translatable learnings, the frameworks, and like not just entrepreneurship as a career path, but also as a way of thinking that is like applicable to so many different spaces.
Exactly.
And then, so you've been at a large firm, you've been at a small firm, like you've seen a breadth of different kind of roles that someone can go into tech, especially thinking about the MBA and the skill sets that you develop. Like, what are some other roles within the tech world that you've seen like some of your classmates go into?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different roles. So one of the more common ones that I've seen is business ops, which is, depending on the company, it's sort of like an internal consultant at a tech company. A second one would be product marketing management, PMM. Very, very common to go into. And then there's sort of a whole host of other more refined things at smaller companies or larger companies that call them different stuff. So they run the gamut, right? Like you can be on the non-development side of the house and still definitely be in in the tech world, having come from an MBA, right? You can deploy more strategic skills purely, or you can be on the product side. So I've seen people go into a variety of roles there. That's one of the, in my opinion, that's one of the beauties of kind of a general management MBA. It purposely makes you very malleable. One of the frustrating things about it could be that it doesn't set you on like a super narrow path. So I think that's a really important consideration for folks who are thinking about a full-time general management MBA, to know, like, you know, it sort of like opens up a lot of doors, but it will force you to do a lot of research and testing to see like which of the many opportunities are right for you.
Yeah, and then pivoting, right? Like
Yeah,
post graduation, that's probably not going to be your career for the rest of your life.
100%.
And so how do you set up like for the skills to thrive elsewhere? Because you've already pivoted, right, from large to small.
That's right. Yeah, and you know, I think for me, actually, one of the main sort of like the last push for me to end up actually applying for an MBA, it was because I had gone to a point so I worked at a company called Zenefits prior to the GSB. And, you know, I had been there for a year. I had done some other stuff at a different company, but I had been there for a year. Felt like I was doing really well. Folks really appreciating my work. And I decided that I wanted to switch to a different team internally. I actually wanted to switch from implementation to product marketing. And so, you know, I went through a pretty disorganized internal process. It was a small company. There was no like official process. I spoke with the person who was running that team, and she ended up giving me like a little case exercise. I saw it and she's like, "Oh, great. We'd love to have you join." And, you know, eventually what happened was, and so I was like, "That's amazing. I'm so excited about this new opportunity," because I was tired of where I was working. I wanted to learn new skills. And I ended up for a certain amount of time getting blocked. And the thing that they told me was like, "You're doing well where you are. You're doing very well where you are. We need you here." And, you know, for me personally, I was at a point where I was like, "No, I want to to do this." And that was actually the thing that prompted me to apply for an MBA. I ended up seeing an MBA as a way to make sure that my career was future proofed. It does not necessarily need to be like super successful day one, high flying, but it does give you the skills to have a really like fascinating and dynamic career for, in my opinion, for decades. Like it gives you the general skills to be able to pivot and not pigeonhole yourself. And so for me, that like with the point that I was at there, I was like, no, I don't want to be told that this is the appropriate path for you. Like I want to set out on my own paths, but I want to make sure that I have kind of the toolkit to do that. And so for me, like that MBA experience was a part of that guarantee.
Yeah, that's helpful. I know I get asked all the time from people like, how do you know it's the right time? Or even like, I don't know if I need an MBA to be successful or thrive in X, Y, or Z field. So like, why go? Right? And so even thinking that long game.
I think that's a super good question. Yeah. So, you know, for me, I thought about it as a long game. I think it's a really good question, right? Like for a lot of folks, they're like, "I'm kicking butt at my current place. Like I'm good. Like I don't need an out." And, you know, thinking back to a lot of my classmates, like that's where they were doing incredibly well. And they still decided to take that time. And the way that it's funny, you know, when I was applying, I went actually to GSB admission session, and the director of admissions at the time, Derek, sort of said this thing, which again, you kind of take with a grain of salt, because of course, you know, he's trying to recruit people, but he said it's never going to be truly feel comfortable and never truly going to feel like the right time to go. It's always going to be a bit of an uncomfortable decision. And if it is uncomfortable, a slightly uncomfortable decision, it's probably the right time. And for some reason that actually really resonated with me. It's like if you wait until the point where you feel like you've stagnated in your career and then you need it, you probably waited just like a little bit too long, which I get is like a very uncomfortable feeling. Obviously an MBA is not the right thing for everyone at all, but I find it hard to believe that you'll be at a point where you're like, this is the perfect point for me to go now, right? Like there's always a reason why not. There's always a reason to go elsewhere. So you really have to ask yourself, like, why would I go? What's the value that I would get? What am I trading off? And have like a really serious conversation with yourself and your stakeholders around in your life around like, when I put everything down on a paper, my mental checklist, or however you make decisions, like, is this right? But it'll never be like a binary obvious decision, like, duh, like that was the right time, that was the right school. I think it's difficult to get to that sort of clarity, at least for me.
Yeah, so let's sit down with your younger self and have that conversation. You probably didn't think you're going to be having this conversation today,
No,
but this
definitely.
is stemming from a question from Annie about like, what was the value add for you after 6 months? So now that you're thinking like younger you from, pre MBA, where you're like putting that decision, like, how am I going to think about its worth to you today, like 6 months or just afterwards? Like, how would you articulate that to your younger self to like help them like come to a decision?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the way that I look at it now, it goes back to that, at least for me, I had always seen my MBA as a long-term investment in my future self. So it was not something that I expected that the day after graduation would be this like, oh my gosh, I turned the page and like everything is different. And it's one of those things, at least for me, where I see the lessons in like small bits throughout my day, like thinking back to the last 3 years, like consistently throughout the last 3 years. And I anticipate that I will keep seeing that as time goes on. And so like a part of it definitely, like, it did help me get to the job at a larger company that I was interested in pursuing right after the GSB. So that's kind of like a very tangible thing that it did. But I think more importantly, what it enabled me to do is to have that flexibility to be able to be in a variety of different situations that it's hard to anticipate being in, and be like, I did sort of go through a laboratory that helped prepare me for that. Or, I did have a classmate who worked in that industry, or I did have like this really rich conversation with someone about this particular problem that they had, and now I'm going through it. Or I need to form a partnership for work, and hey, this other GSBer is on the other side. So like you sort of see the value in like a variety of different ways throughout.
Nice. And then there's a question here. So actually multiple questions around like, hey, I'm going to distill it. And these are questions from Ryan and Ade and Jinseo about, we talked a little bit about classes, but for folks who are like thinking about pivoting or exploring, what are some opportunities and resources that can help you get at least a little bit of experience in that world, and kind of get your feet wet?
I assume that they're asking while at the GSB, because obviously like some people. So I think I can think of a few things that, so some of my classmates, for example, decided to take classes, what we call across the street, which is outside of the GSB at other Stanford classes. So some people decided to take classes at the design school, for example. Some people took classes in the computer science department. God bless them. There are a whole bunch of things that being at a school like Stanford allows you to do. So that's one. I think the second thing is doing like a part-time during the year internship, which again is a sacrifice and a trade-off. But hey, part of being in product is all about trade-offs. And so like way to practice that in real life. So, I think that's incredibly helpful. I think going to really like tapping into the alumni network is critical from day one. And it's a lot of work. Like, networking, some people love networking, other people despise networking. But no matter how you look at it, it's incredibly time consuming. I think it's rewarding and fun, but like it's really time consuming. And so being able to spend a bunch of your time having conversations with people in different industries, different company sizes, because one of the the beauties and frustrating things about product is that when you ask people what a product manager does, the answer will range from A to Z, especially if you ask people at different companies. And so it's actually really important to be able to do the research to understand, like, okay, is this someone who's doing more strategy? Are they spending like 80% of their time with just engineering and design? Are they more on the go-to-market side? Like, you know, and how does that fit my strengths and my desires? And how can I use that to refine my career search better so that I can achieve both like my desired outcomes, but what I'm capable of doing given my prior background. So I would do a combo of those, right? Like talk to alumni, you know, outside of classes, talk to a bunch of your classmates. A lot of my classmates actually sort of, that we joke at the GC that everyone has like a side hustle. So a lot of people try to start even outside of like Startup Garage, like they had little things that they were trying out, and hey, like that's a way to both like have real world like experience, but also to beef up your resume a bit. So, you know, and the other thing that folks did, especially when they were trying to transition, is they did either like incredibly low paid or unpaid internships, which at smaller companies, to at least get a sense of what product would be like if they had no experience. And you can do that while you're in school. It's not as big of a sacrifice as obviously doing something unpaid post graduation, which is a really big decision and investment.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to something you said a little bit earlier about like spending a lot of time and energy in networking, and
Yeah.
how some people like thrive in it and others it's a little bit more effort.
Yeah.
Having gone through that process yourself and kind of lessons learned along the way, for those of us who find it a little bit more draining, like any tips or inspiration and words of encouragement that you have to help us think about like what is networking? How can we apply it, especially in the tech space?
I would think about it. I would try to, you know, some people approach networking as like, so I would say quality is better than quantity, right? So if you're thinking about networking as like, if I have 50 conversations and they're each like boom, 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 like kind of 15 minutes, very focused, like I'm sure I'll get something out of them. I'm like, yeah, you might. It sounds really painful. Like you have to be a very particular sort of person to do that. I would focus on quality. So having spending more time, doing more research, but having less conversations actually like would be my advice for the majority of the time, to like invest in a conversation, really go deep with someone who's a proper fit. But then obviously like, yeah, part of it is sure, like it's a numbers game, but that I would more tailor towards keep an eye, like have quick conversations with classmates, even if y'all aren't best friends or you don't necessarily see like the right path, but like choose where you're investing the time, choose which alumni you're reaching out to, like don't like run yourself dry. Like I think networking will be a lot less painful if you're having conversations with people that you truly find to be like valuable and interesting. I don't think it'll be, you know, 100% of the time. Sometimes it's like, yeah, it's a bit of work and it's a grind, but I think if most of the networking that you do is stuff that you find to be interesting, which will probably mean just like less conversations, you're gonna be like, okay, like that was, maybe it took me a little bit to click send on that email. Maybe it took me a little bit to like get out of the house to go to like Coupa in the middle of campus, even though I was like, oh God, I really don't want to do the awkward coffee meetup. But otherwise, like, I feel like once you sit down and have the conversation, it's really rewarding. And I guess now in the world of COVID, it'll probably be via Zoom, but you got my point.
Yeah. Here's a question from Sophia that has a number of upvotes. What surprised you about the PM role or experience coming out of the GSB? And like we talked a little bit about, actually a lot about like how the GSB set you up for success, but yeah, any surprises?
Yeah, I mean, so at least for me, right, the role that I took after the GSB was at PayPal, which, you know, is not massive like Google, but it's quite large. And so it was not a total shocker because again, like I interned there, but just the sheer amount of time that I spent sort of like convincing people of stuff rather than solving a problem, or actually building things, that was a bit of a surprise, and a bit of a disappointment. And I think it might have been a function of the particular team that I went on, which was more of like a newer team at a big company, which was really exciting for me actually. But then I think looking back on it, it meant that it was a lot of like trying to get people on board with really like unbaked ideas. And so for me, a learning from that was, okay, I should try to, like, I get a lot of energy out of seeing impact, which I don't think is like a rare thing, but at least for me, like that has like a very concrete positive reinforcing cycle. And so that was one of the reasons why I decided to go to my current company, to Rippling, which is and was a lot smaller, but fast growing. And like, it is much easier for me to see the impact that my work is doing, technically in the same role as a product manager, which like day in and day out, I am able to ship little things, or big things, and see how our customers are using them, see the pleasure or pain that they're bringing customers. And for me, like that's a huge like positive reinforcing cycle. I'm like, ooh, I want more of that. I will work harder. Whereas at least for me, when I was at PayPal, I just spent a ton of time doing PowerPoint presentations, which I knew was going to be a part of the role. I did not anticipate that it would consume that proportion of it, like as high of a proportion of my time as it did.
Yeah, and it sounds like in any presentation, some of those soft skills, interpersonal dynamics, learnings, acting with power probably came in really handy.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So that was helpful. I was able to navigate it well. I just had gotten to a point where I said, okay, but do I want to spend 80%? Like, do I want to spend 20% of my time kind of talking in between teams and doing presentations, or do I want to spend 80% of my time? And so at least for me, like that decision to move to Rippling, at least at this very like fine-tuned stage in my career, I was like, okay, I want to shift it. Like I'm very realistic. I understand that inner dynamics at work are critical to succeed. Like that's one of my learnings from the GSB. But I would prefer to optimize for less of my time being spent that way.
Yeah. And here's a question from David that this is the first time I've heard this question. I really appreciate it because we talk a lot about like spirit of collaboration, community. But David wants to know like what opportunities are available for GSB students interested in tech or product to connect and or work on projects together. Like we talk a lot about like supporting each other, but on a more tactical side, does it happen?
Yeah, it's a great. So I mean, it definitely happens. So like immediately when you ask that question, Startup Garage comes to mind, right? Like that's a very like tangible way. Like the point of the way that Startup Garage works is that you end up forming teams of 4 to 5 people, and you propose like a high level problem statement, and you form these teams. And so that's probably one of the more like concrete ways that the GSB facilitates that. That said, there are a bunch of like ad hoc ways that people end up sort of collaborating. There are also things like, there are things like career groups your first year where you get put together and you have a facilitator from the CMC, where you talk about this sort of stuff. So I say that there's more like tactical hands-on things, and actually like, a lot of your classes end up having group-based projects, which is a double-edged sword, but a good learning. So it'll sort of depend, right? Like if I saw a bunch of folks from my class who ended up either starting side hustles and or real companies together throughout their times at the GSB. Some of them are still working on these companies, and most of them were not Startup Garage. It was like, hey, I'm interested in this. Hey, I'm interested in this. Hey, like we either have the same background or we have complementary backgrounds. Like, let's try to like work on this together. Or what we joke about, the classic, like try to recruit a CS student to work with you. I saw a little bit of that trying to happen, but hopefully we can dispel those stereotypes. I think GSVers can do their own work without recruiting poor CS undergrads from
but there is a lot of interaction with other parts of campus, right? Just
absolutely
the different the D school courses.
Yeah, I was going to say these school courses. There's also like biodesign is a good one where they end up bringing folks from like the engineering school and I think from the D school and from the GSB. So I saw that kind of manifest itself in a few different ways.
Yeah, there's a number of interdisciplinary courses that folks can take it, or like you said, taking classes from other departments on campus. Yeah. Great way to like broaden your horizons, both intellectually and like network-wise as well.
Absolutely.
All right. And so I'm going to be selfish and take this last question. I'm curious. We actually haven't talked about the application much at all. Mm-hmm. And even though you don't know, and you probably never will know why you were admitted, even though you are pretty awesome. And I loved spending this like last 55 minutes with you. If you could give yourself, younger self, any advice about the application process, what would you tell yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, as you said, I think one of the things that I joke about is like after people get into the GSB, they have all these like fancy theories about why they got in. No one knows why they got in unless you like tapped into the admissions office's files. So I think for me though, what I would say is that what I would tell myself looking back at the process is to try to enjoy it, which sounds really tongue-in-cheek. But it is a rare time, especially when you are like, at least for me, I was like heads down and working a full-time job, as I assume like the vast majority of the folks on this call are, or having like a life, an interpersonal life. And I remember at the time when I was applying, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to think about what matters most to me and why. You have got to be kidding me. But it really forces you to have a unique, like retrospective, like moment about yourself and like, why is it that you're looking to invest 2 years of your life and not an insignificant amount of money in a program? And so like, it's a rare opportunity to be able to be introspective where there's so many other things happening around you in life. And it can be, if you do spend the time really going deep and thinking about like, okay, why is this the right time for me? What do I want to get out of this? Like, why is it that I think it'll be helpful? What do I want to do after? It's just like, it is an incredibly like rewarding introspective thing. Like probably like, even if you don't get in. And I remember there's a GSB grad from 2016 who was telling me this when I was applying. And I do remember being like, yeah, easy for you to say, because you got in. And she was like an MBA too at the time. But it's really, I don't know, it's really true. And like the other thing that I'd say is no one else can like come up with the right answer for you, because the combination of things around like why it's the right time, what you want to do with it, why you like it, you can't fake, like it has to be, that answer has to come from investing the time and thinking about all those questions, and the story will inevitably be like uniquely for yourself. So I would tell myself to like enjoy the process despite it being rightfully incredibly stressful.
Thank you so much for your wisdom, sharing your experiences. Speaking of the application, next week we are holding a series of events themed Application Week, where we are actually going to go into all different facets of like telling your story. What does your story mean in a business school application context? What are ways to start it? How do you put pen to paper? How do you convey it to people over kind of speaking? And we also have a number of different panels with admission officers about the parts of the application. How do we use it? What are ways that you can think about, understanding who you are in our process and how to put your best foot forward? And if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to start a mystanford.mba dashboard with a few questions there. Will help consolidate and put together things that might be of most interest to you. So with that, thank you again, Tomer. I had a lot of fun. I can't wait to see you on campus, hopefully in the near future. Everybody who joined us, thank you for sharing your time with us. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe.